Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, have you ever attempted to translate a text from one language to another?
Yes, but only as part of school assignments. I've never mastered another language well enough to translate anything for a general audience. Why do you ask?
I find it's more difficult than it seems. Language is culture, so translation is not just a matter of finding a word with an equivalent meaning. It's also a matter of finding a concept or an idea in the target language's culture with an equivalent meaning.
Right, and there may not even be an equivalent idea or concept in the target language. It may take one word to express the idea in the original, but 1,000 in the target.
Exactly. Plus, translators are usually outsiders to at least one, perhaps both, of the languages they're working with. Thus, they're always interpreting whatever idea it is that they're trying to translate, and they could have biased interpretations, or there could be different interpretations. And, as humans like any other, they could simply make mistakes.
It's a wonder anything at all gets usefully translated with such difficulty.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing the Buddhist figure Kumarajiva. Who is Kumarajiva? What did he do in his life? How did that affect Buddhism in East Asia? We hope you enjoy.
So let's get to it. Who is Kumarajiva?
Kumarajiva was a famous Chinese Buddhist monk, scholar, and translator. He originated from present-day Xinjiang, which is in the far west of China. He's said to have been born in 344 Common Era in the kingdom of Fuōchō, in the western reaches of the Tarim Basin, a large oval-shaped desert in northwestern China. His father was a monk named Kumarajiva from the Kashmir region of northwestern India, and his mother was royalty in the Fuōchō region, whose family name was Jiva. By their naming conventions, their names were combined into Kumarajiva.
As a side note, we would not feel right mentioning where he is from without adding that this place is now the site of a genocide of Uyghurs being carried out by the Chinese Communist Party. This area is historically Uyghur, a Muslim-majority Turkic ethnicity that originates from Central Asia. This is a cultural, ethnic, and religious genocide. Kumarajiva was likely part Uyghur himself. As with all instances of oppression and genocide, we condemn the suffering that China is inflicting on the Uyghurs wholeheartedly. With current events acknowledged, we now return to discussing Kumarajiva.
So with his birth, we already have an interesting episode. If his father Kumarajiva was a monk, how did he marry and have children? To be clear, this happened before versions of Buddhism that relaxed the rules that directed monks to remain celibate. The legend goes that Kumarajiva resolved to travel from India to China to spread an earlier version of what would be the Mahayana Dharma. He stopped in Fuōchō in the palace of the king, Jiva's older brother. The king was so impressed by Kumarajiva that he offered up Jiva to marry him. Both parties agreed, so Kumarajiva became the royal monk of Fuōchō and fathered Kumarajiva. It's not really known why Kumarajiva broke his monastic vows, but the best guess we have is that he was an early Mahayana thinker amenable to disregarding the rule of celibacy, or he may have disrobed himself or been disrobed as a monk when he formally became a part of the king's court. No one really knows. At the age of 9, Kumarajiva himself began studying Sarvastivada Buddhism all around Central Asia, and rose to prominence in Madhyamaka philosophy and scriptural knowledge until being fully ordained at 20. In 379 CE, when he was around 35, his fame had spread to the imperial court of the former Qin dynasty in China, and the emperor at the time, Fujian, wanted Kumarajiva to come to his court as a royal priest. He decided the most obvious way to do this was to send his top general, Lu Guang, to capture the entire kingdom of Fuōchō, and then return with Kumarajiva as a prisoner. The conquest took 7 years and ended in failure. General Lu Guang actually defected and declared himself an independent warlord in the region. He captured the 40-year-old Kumarajiva in 386 CE and held him prisoner for years. Kumarajiva learned Chinese during his imprisonment with Lu Guang. Eventually, Lu Guang forced Kumarajiva to marry and to break his monastic vows. Meanwhile, the former Qin dynasty was overthrown in the east, and the new dynasty, called the later Qin, begged Lu Guang to free Kumarajiva and send him to their capital in Chang'an. Lu Guang refused, and in response the new dynastic armies fought and defeated him. Finally, Kumarajiva was freed and he was taken back to Chang'an. In Chang'an, he was set up as the head of a translation house in the imperial court, where he worked to translate numerous Sanskrit texts into Chinese. His tenure at Chang'an is puzzling and contentious to many scholars. Some think of him as just a prisoner under a different regime, but others think that this was a very cushy position. He was given national rank and title from the emperor, who looked on him as his own personal teacher. How much of his work in the translation house was coercive or involuntary in light of the emperor freeing him from Lu Guang and saving his life is unclear. Nevertheless, within 12 years, Kumarajiva's translation house had translated about 35 sutras into 294 scrolls. His translations are still in use today in Chinese Buddhism. Kumarajiva had 4 main disciples who worked in the translation house: Daosheng, who was known for being the first Buddhist thinker to ascribe Buddha nature to Ichantakas and an important commentator on the Lotus Sutra, as well as Seng Zhao, Daorong, and Seng Rui. These monks all had very important and influential careers in various sects of early Chinese Buddhism. Though the sects were not nearly as defined as they are in the present, we can observe that Kumarajiva's and his disciples' translations became incredibly important and influential on the development of Chan, Pure Land, Tiantai, and Sanlun Buddhism. Not much is known for sure about Kumarajiva's death. He is said to have died in 413 or 414, which would have made him about 68 or 69. He didn't die in a special way. He likely just grew old and died in the capital at Chang'an. Afterward, his translation house was dissolved, and his disciples went on to do other things. Nevertheless, while he was alive and working with his translation house, he was very prolific, and we'll talk some more about what he wrote and translated in the next question.
What did Kumarajiva do in his life?
The biggest contribution he made was the sheer volume of translations of the canon from Pali and Sanskrit and Prakrit to Chinese. Many of the Chinese and Japanese equivalents we have for words and concepts in Sanskrit come directly from his translation work. He was uniquely skilled at taking Sanskrit words and creating equivalent terms in Chinese that were highly intelligible and readable, but were also didactic in that the words themselves explained some of the concepts they referred to. For some context, Sanskrit script is a syllabary, where the script indicates sounds only, but Chinese script is made of ideograms, which indicate their meaning and their sound. Thus, when he translated the word Mahayana as Da Cheng, readers had an impression of what it meant, and that it meant great vehicle. The same goes with nearly all other terms we use on this show. By extension, because Koreans and Japanese adopted Chinese script, Kumarajiva's translations have a direct influence on how they refer to Buddhist ideas as well. Many across the centuries have lauded his fidelity and his preciseness in his translations. However, not all of them were perfect. Translation is interpretation, so naturally when Buddhism is entering China by means of this translation tradition, it is subject to Kumarajiva's interpretations of the meanings of things. For example, he was the first to translate dukkha into a word that refers to painful suffering and struggle. This is a translation that we have challenged on the show in the past, and there are no doubt other examples like this as well. Nevertheless, because of his influence via his translations, one could think of him as the architect of Chinese Buddhism. Because he brought the texts into Chinese at his own discretion, much of how Chinese Buddhism is understood could be attributed to him. Also, his affiliation with Sarvastivada Buddhism likely has an effect on that as well, resulting in Sarvastivada Buddhism having a strong influence on how we interpret Chinese equivalents to Sanskrit terms from the original Buddhist text as well. He and his committee translated the Diamond Sutra, the larger and smaller Pure Land Sutras, the Lotus Sutra, the Vimalakirti Sutra, the Prajnaparamita Sutras, Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika, and much more. As you can see, this is a rock-star list of Mahayana sutras that we have read and discussed on the show and will soon read and discuss on the show. Many of the translations into English we work with are translations directly from Kumarajiva's Chinese translations, and that's by design. His translations are simultaneously the most complete and the most intact we have, as well as being the closest to the original text. In other words, not only are his manuscripts complete and intact and available to us, but they are translations from the original Sanskrit, not translations of translations of translations. This makes a huge difference in getting what the original text actually says, because you're not seeing the result of a centuries or millennia-long telephone game.
There's a practical way to demonstrate why this is important. If you're curious, enter an English idiom or line from a song into a translation program, take those results and translate them to a third language, and then translate that back into English. The more language layers you add to this experiment, the more garbled the final result will be.
Similarly, these manuscripts establish the existence of an original Sanskrit equivalent text in cases where said original were not preserved. He was very fastidious and most likely did not make stuff up and write it in the Buddha's voice. He was also a writer and a scholar himself, and is said to have been the founder of the Sanlun school of Buddhism. Sanlun translates to 3 treatises, and it refers to 3 specific texts authored by Madhyamaka thinker Nagarjuna. These are the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, the treatise on the 12 gates, and the 100-verse treatise. These all deal with emptiness and the middle way according to Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka philosophy. I think it's important to note that this philosophy did not exist in China up to this point, and so Kumarajiva and his disciples were the sole parties responsible for its propagation. He wrote occasionally on the middle way and emptiness, but he was far more prolific as a translator.
How did that affect Buddhism in East Asia?
I think that it's safe to say that there would not be any East Asian Mahayana Buddhism to speak of without the work of Kumarajiva and his translation house. Of course, there were people who were bringing Buddhist texts, icons, rituals, oral traditions, and other materials with them across borders as part of trade and travel and exchange, but Kumarajiva and his translation house were the most prolific and the most systematic translators for the most important and lengthy Mahayana sutras. His imperial sponsorship also meant that he had more resources available to him to assist in his translations, such as access to the highest level scholar monks in all of the Qin lands, money and time to devote to these translations, and existing networks to distribute and copy the translations once they were finished. Without the work of his translation house, it could have been centuries before key foundational texts like the Lotus Sutra, the Nirvana Sutra, and more were translated into Chinese. Before his translation work, the primary religions in China were Taoism and Confucianism, and calling them religions is shaky because Chinese language at the time didn't have an equivalent to the English word religion. Taoism and Confucianism were combined with a specific type of animism and local folk religiosity that is virtually impossible to get a handle on. To simplify things enough to be understood, at the top level, there was state-level textual and ritual tradition having to do with propitiation of ancestors, practices of divination, and geomancy, and with textual and philosophical debate about how states ought to be ruled and why. The different ritual and textual traditions, the different arguments for statecraft, and the different expressions of ancestor worship are what we group into the categories of Confucianism and Taoism. Meanwhile, at the lower level, there was worship and propitiation of local gods, of forests, of animals, of the harvest, of weather, and more. These sort of coexisted at different layers of society, and the traditions mixed and influenced each other. Buddhism had been encountered in the far western regions of what we now call China, but as we mentioned, translation was sparse before Kumarajiva. It wasn't widely sponsored, and the translations were not propagated to larger networks of power. There were Buddhists in China, but they had to learn Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit, Tibetan, and other Central Asian languages to engage with the sutras. After Kumarajiva's translations, Buddhism exploded in popularity in China because the texts were way more accessible, and they filtered down from the top layers of power, and so were widely distributed and propagated. Also, the translations were uniquely readable and accessible compared to previous ones. Kumarajiva played a significant role in systematizing how concepts such as dukkha, shunyata, and karma were linguistically and culturally translated into Chinese, rendering them knowable and intelligible in a way that previous translations simply hadn't. This built the textual foundation for how Buddhism spread in China from the 4th century onward. The imperial reputation also led to there being numerous Buddhist emperors in China soon after, which led to further propagation and further sponsorship for temple construction, ordination, and the creation of art and icons. I would also like to briefly mention how Kumarajiva has come back into the cultural discourse as sort of a mascot for the Chinese Communist Party in the media. This is not on a huge scale, but in the last 15-ish years, the CCP has spoken of Kumarajiva as the sole creator of Chinese Buddhism and as one of the founding fathers of Chinese culture as a whole. His role in the popularization of Buddhism in China is obviously enough to make him a famous historical icon, but there's a deeper, more insidious layer to it. Because he was born in Xinjiang, his image and his historical significance are being co-opted and revised in order to suggest and represent the Sinicization of Xinjiang and Central Asia in general, the fundamental Chineseness of Buddhism, even though it originated in India, and the Sinicization of all of China's minority ethnicities and minority groups in general.
To clarify, the word Sinicization means the act or process of making something more Chinese in character, or bringing something under Chinese influence. This is historical revisionism being used for political control and cultural appropriation.
Exactly. Importantly, Sinicization requires that one define what is and is not essentially Chinese in character, and a lot of that definition ends up being wholly invented. To do this, one must come up with an idea of what makes something Chinese in character, and this is incredibly difficult, and it's usually done with an exclusionary agenda in mind. In other words, it's done with the purpose of shutting people out. It's done with the purpose of saying this and that are not Chinese, but this is Chinese. Is something or somebody Chinese because it comes from that region of Asia? No, because there are thousands of different cultures and ethnicities within the borders of what we now call China. Is it that it is in the context of the Chinese language? No, because there are thousands of Chinese dialects and thousands of other languages that are spoken inside the borders of what we now call China. You can see how this is a difficult and most of the time arbitrary process. Back to Kumarajiva. He's being touted as a figure representing the essential Chineseness of Buddhism, but also of the Central Asian cultures and the peoples that the CCP are interested in possessing territorially and economically. There are many other historical figures who get rolled out in situations similar to this. Confucius was one, Lao Tzu is another, and famous emperors from Chinese history are others. China is also setting the groundwork to do this when the current Dalai Lama passes away. For more on that specifically, check out our Buddhist episode on the succession of the Dalai Lama, which will be linked in the show notes. Most of the time, they have the same motivations: to inspire nationalism, to control the narrative of what it really means to be Chinese, and to justify or revise the CCP's history of minority subjugation, expansionism, and even genocide, as in the recent case of the Uyghurs of Xinjiang. So keep that in mind when researching Kumarajiva. There are some information sources with ulterior motives around him.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of Kumarajiva. Join us next week where we will discuss Shingon Buddhist sacred spaces. What are some characteristics of Shingon Buddhist sacred spaces? How do they differ from other Buddhist sacred spaces? How are Shingon sacred spaces influenced by texts and doctrines? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
If you like our show and would like to support us, we ask that you instead send that generous support to a worthy cause. Currently, that is easing the weaponized famine that is tearing through Gaza. Because of blockades, charities and aid organizations can't do much. The best we can do is directly donate to GoFundMe campaigns or the like. For now, we're pointing at the page for Tashneem Mahmood, a mother of 3 who has lost her apartment in the bombing. If you are able, please send some support her way.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.